Dr. Sarah Chen pressed her face against the observation deck's reinforced glass, watching the alien landscape of Kepler 442b stretch endlessly before her. The research station hummed quietly around her, a testament to human engineering nestled on a world that shouldn't have supported any form of complex life. Yet here they were, 3 years into the most significant xenobiological discovery in human history. The Kythera were unlike anything in Earth's fossil record. Standing nearly 3 meters tall on powerful hind legs with razor-sharp claws and bioluminescent striping along their muscular frames, they resembled a terrifying fusion of Earth's apex predators. Their intelligence, however, set them apart from mere beasts. They had developed sophisticated hunting strategies, used primitive tools, and most remarkably, displayed complex social structures that rivaled early human civilizations. Sarah had been the first xenobiologist to establish peaceful contact with a Kythera pack 18 months ago. It had taken weeks of careful observation and gradual approach before the alpha female, whom Sarah had named Zara, allowed her within 50 meters of the den. Now Sarah was the only human the pack trusted completely. "Another supply drop delayed," announced Dr. Marcus Webb, the station commander, as he entered the observation lounge. His weathered face bore the stress lines of someone managing humanity's most remote outpost. The cargo ship encountered engine problems in the outer system. "We're looking at another 2 weeks minimum." Sarah nodded absently, her attention focused on movement near the rocky outcropping where Zara's pack had established their territory. 5 small forms tumbled and played in the alien afternoon sun, their bioluminescent patches flickering in patterns that Sarah was beginning to understand represented emotional states. The cubs were barely 6 months old, still dependent on their parents for everything. "The cubs are growing fast," Sarah murmured. "Zara brought down a thornback yesterday that must have weighed 200 kilos. She's an incredible hunter." Marcus joined her at the window. "Speaking of hunting, the geological team found something interesting in the northern valley. Unusual mineral formations that don't match anything in our databases. Command wants a full survey, but I'm hesitant to send teams into unexplored territory without knowing how the locals might react." "The Kythera are territorial, but not unreasonably aggressive," Sarah replied. "As long as we stay clear of active den sites and don't interfere with their hunting grounds, they generally ignore human activity. Zara's pack has shown curiosity about our vehicles, but no hostility." Through the glass, Sarah watched as one of the cubs, a particularly bold male she'd nicknamed Scout, wandered further from the den than usual. The cub's mother, Vera, immediately moved to guide him back with gentle nudges of her massive head. The display of parental care never failed to move Sarah. These creatures, despite their fearsome appearance, showed remarkable tenderness toward their young. The station's communication array crackled to life with an incoming transmission from Earth. The message, delayed by the vast distances of space, brought updates from the homeworld and instructions from the Colonial Science Division. Sarah listened with half an ear as Marcus spoke with Mission Control, her attention drawn back to the Kythera family below. Something was wrong. Zara stood at the entrance to the den, her normally flowing movements sharp and agitated. Her bioluminescent strips pulsed in rapid, chaotic patterns that Sarah had never observed before. The other adults in the pack were responding similarly, their bodies tense with obvious distress. "Marcus," Sarah called urgently, "something's happening with the pack." The commander cut short his transmission and joined her at the observation window. Below them, the Kythera were moving with purpose now, not the leisurely pace of their usual afternoon routine. Adult pack members were herding the cubs toward the deeper recesses of their rocky territory. Suddenly, the ground beneath the research station trembled. At first, Sarah thought it might be seismic activity, but the vibration continued, growing stronger. Through the station's hall, she could hear a low rumbling that seemed to come from the planet itself. "Seismic sensors are going crazy," reported Dr. Lisa Park from the geology station. "This isn't tectonic activity. The readings are unlike anything in our database." The rumbling intensified, and Sarah watched in horror as cracks began appearing in the rocky outcropping that housed the Kythera den. Superheated gas began venting from fissures in the stone, and the alien equivalent of flames started licking at the edges of the pack's territory. "It's a thermal vent activation," Lisa called out, her voice tight with concern. "The mineral formations we detected must have been blocking underground magma flows. Something's caused a massive pressure release. On the ground below, chaos erupted. The adult Kythera were frantically trying to evacuate their den as more vents opened around their territory. The superheated gases would be lethal to the cubs, whose respiratory systems were still developing. Sarah watched as Zara emerged from the den's main entrance, followed by the other adults. But she couldn't see the cubs. "We have to help them," Sarah said, already moving toward the station's equipment lockers. "Absolutely not," Marcus replied firmly. "Our atmospheric suits aren't designed for those temperatures, and we don't know how the adults will react under stress. They might attack anything that approaches." Sarah was already pulling on her environmental gear. "Those cubs will die if someone doesn't get them out. The adults are too large to navigate the smaller passages where the cubs are probably hiding." Through the observation window, they could see Zara making desperate attempts to reach the cubs. But the expanding thermal vents were cutting off access routes. Her massive frame, perfect for hunting and protection, was now a liability in the increasingly dangerous terrain. "Sarah, I cannot authorize this," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. They both knew that losing the cubs would devastate the pack and potentially undo years of careful relationship building. Sarah sealed her helmet and checked her suit's integrity. The thermal protection would give her perhaps 30 minutes in the heated environment below. It would have to be enough. "Tell Earth that if this goes wrong, it was my decision alone," she said, heading for the station's airlock. As the outer door cycled open, Sarah could feel the heat even through her suit's protection. The landscape that had been peacefully alien an hour ago now resembled a vision of hell, with superheated gas creating a deadly maze between her and 5 innocent lives that desperately needed saving. Sarah's boots hit the alien soil with a thud that she felt through her entire body. The environmental suit's cooling systems immediately kicked into overdrive as the external temperature readings climbed past anything the equipment had been designed to handle. Through her helmet's display, warning symbols flashed urgent red as the suit's computer calculated her rapidly diminishing safety margin. The landscape before her had transformed into something from humanity's deepest nightmares. What had been solid rock formations an hour ago now leaked superheated gas that turned the air itself into a shimmering, deadly curtain. The Kythera den, carved into what the geological team had assumed was stable stone, was slowly being consumed by thermal vents that opened like hungry mouths across the territory. Zara stood at the den's entrance, her massive form silhouetted against the growing glow of the thermal activity. The alpha female's bioluminescent strips were pulsing in patterns so rapid and chaotic that Sarah's translation algorithms couldn't parse them. Desperation, Sarah realized. The universal language of a parent watching their children face mortal danger. As Sarah approached, the other adult Kythera noticed her presence. Under normal circumstances, they might have investigated this unusual human behavior with curiosity or mild concern. But with their cubs trapped and their territory literally burning around them, their reaction was immediate and aggressive. 3 adults turned toward Sarah, their claws extending and their throat sacs inflating in threat displays that made her environmental suit's audio sensors crackle with static. "Easy," Sarah said aloud, knowing they couldn't understand her words, but hoping her tone might penetrate their panic. She raised her hand slowly, palms outward. In the gesture she'd learned indicated peaceful intentions to the Kythera. Zara's head snapped toward Sarah, and for a moment, the human feared she'd made a fatal miscalculation. The alpha female's eyes, each the size of Sarah's fist, focused on her with an intensity that made her feel like prey. Then, in a moment that would haunt Sarah's dreams for years to come, she saw something she'd never witnessed in any predator species. Hope. Zara's bioluminescent patterns shifted, and Sarah's suit computer managed to identify a few recognizable sequences: help, cubs, danger. The simple concepts that transcended species, barriers when parents faced every mother's worst nightmare. A new thermal vent erupted barely 10 meters away, sending a geyser of superheated gas into the air. Sarah's suit alarm chimed urgently as her external temperature reading spiked. She had minutes at most before her protection failed completely. Sarah pointed toward the den entrance, then at herself, trying to communicate her intentions. The other adults were still agitated, their threat displays continuing, but Zara seemed to understand. The alpha female moved aside, creating a path to the den's mouth while keeping her massive body between Sarah and the other pack members. The den entrance was smaller than Sarah had expected. The adult Kythera, with their 3-meter frames and broad shoulders, would have difficulty navigating the inner passages even under ideal conditions. Now, with thermal vents opening randomly throughout the tunnel system, their size had become a death sentence for any rescue attempt. Sarah activated her suit's headlamps and plunged into the den. The temperature inside was slightly lower than the external environment, but still climbing steadily as more vents opened in the surrounding rock. Her suit's computer helpfully informed her that she now had 18 minutes before thermal protection failure. The tunnel system was more complex than the research team had realized. Passages branched and twisted through the rock in patterns that spoke of generations of Kithera engineering. These weren't simple caves, but sophisticated living spaces carved and shaped over decades. Under different circumstances, Sarah would have been fascinated by the architectural sophistication. Now each branching path represented another place where terrified cubs might be hiding. She heard them before she saw them, soft, chittering sounds that her suit's audio pickups barely registered, coming from deeper in the tunnel system. Sarah followed the sound, crawling through passages that grew progressively narrower. The walls around her were warm to the touch, and her external sensors detected dangerous levels of toxic gas building up in the enclosed spaces. In a circular chamber that must have served as a nursery, Sarah found them. 5 cubs, each no larger than a human toddler but already showing the distinctive features that would make them apex predators. Their bioluminescent strips were dim with fear, and they huddled together in the farthest corner from the tunnel entrance. When Sarah's lights illuminated them, they chittered in alarm and pressed themselves even further into the rocky crevice. "It's okay," Sarah whispered, knowing they couldn't understand but hoping her tone might calm them. "I'm here to help." She moved slowly, extending her gloved hand toward the nearest cub. The small creature's eyes, already showing the intelligence that would define its species, watched her approach with obvious terror. When Sarah's hand came within reach, the cub struck out with tiny claws that barely scratched her suit's exterior. 15 minutes remaining. Sarah realized that the cubs would never come willingly. They were scared, trapped, and facing a creature they'd never seen before in an environment that was rapidly becoming lethal. She would have to take them by force, hoping that their parents would understand her intentions. She reached for the nearest cub, wrapping her arms around its small form as gently as possible. The creature immediately began struggling, its claws seeking purchase on her suit while it emitted distress calls that made Sarah's heart ache. But she held on, securing the cub against her chest before reaching for the next one. The second cub bit her glove with needle-sharp teeth that actually managed to penetrate the outer layer of her suit. Warning lights flashed as the environmental seal was compromised, but the inner layers held. Sarah gritted her teeth and grabbed the third cub, adding it to her growing burden. By the time she had collected all 5 cubs, Sarah was carrying nearly 40 kilograms of terrified alien predator while navigating increasingly hot tunnel passages. The cubs had stopped struggling quite so violently, perhaps exhausted by their efforts, but their distress calls continued. Sarah's suit computer informed her that she had 7 minutes before total protection failure. The return journey through the tunnel system was a nightmare of navigation and endurance. The cub's weight made every movement difficult, and the rising temperature was causing her suit's cooling system to work at maximum capacity. When she finally emerged from the den entrance, Sarah was greeted by a sight that stopped her heart. The adult Kithera had formed a semicircle around the den entrance. All of them. Their massive forms blocked her path back to the research station, and their eyes reflected her suit lights like pools of molten gold. For a moment, Sarah was certain that she was about to die. She had committed the ultimate transgression in the animal kingdom. She had taken someone's children. Then Zara stepped forward, her movements careful and deliberate. The alpha female's bioluminescent strips were pulsing in slow, rhythmic patterns that Sarah's computer identified as gratitude and recognition. Zara lowered her massive head until she was eye level with Sarah, and for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, predator and human regarded each other with perfect understanding. Sarah carefully set the cubs down on the ground. They immediately ran to their parents, chittering and flashing their own bioluminescent patterns in what could only be relief and excitement. The adult Kithera surrounded their young, nuzzling and checking them for injuries with a tenderness that brought tears to Sarah's eyes. 3 minutes remaining. Sarah turned toward the research station, but her path was blocked by another thermal vent that had opened while she was underground. The temperature spike was immediate and overwhelming. Her suit's alarms screamed warnings as the protection systems began to fail catastrophically. Sarah staggered backward as the superheated gas from the new thermal vent washed over her failing environmental suit. The protection systems that had kept her alive during the rescue were now screaming warnings through her helmet's display. External temperature readings climbed past the red line while her suit's cooling capacity dropped toward zero. Through the shimmering heat distortion, she could see the research station's emergency airlock cycling open. Marcus and the rest of the team were attempting their own rescue mission, but the expanding thermal field would kill them before they covered half the distance. Their standard environmental suits weren't designed for the hellish conditions that now surrounded the Kythera territory. Sarah's legs buckled as the suit's structural integrity began to fail. The external plating was designed to handle moderate temperature variations, not the extreme thermal stress of active geological venting. She could feel the heat beginning to penetrate the inner layers, and her helmet's display showed that complete system failure was imminent. Behind her, the Kythera pack had gathered around their rescued cubs, but Sarah noticed that Zara and 2 other adults were watching her situation with what could only be described as concern. Their bioluminescent patterns had shifted from the relief of reunion to something more complex. Sarah's failing translation algorithms managed to identify fragments: debt, obligation, assistance. The ground beneath Sarah's feet cracked, and another vent began forming directly in her path to safety. She tried to move around it, but her suit's mobility was compromised by the thermal damage. The servo-assisted joints that normally made the heavy environmental gear manageable were beginning to lock up as their electronic components overheated. Sarah fell to her knees as her suit's power systems started cascading failures. Through her helmet's fading display, she watched the external temperature readings climb to levels that would kill her in seconds once the protection failed completely. She had saved 5 alien lives, but the cost was apparently going to be her own. The impact knocked her flat against the superheated ground. For a moment, Sarah thought a piece of equipment had fallen from the research station, but then she realized that something had grabbed her. Massive claws, each longer than her fingers, had closed around her waist with surprising gentleness. She was being lifted into the air. Through her helmet's cracked visor, Sarah found herself staring into Zara's golden eyes. The alpha female had come for her, ignoring the thermal vents and the obvious danger to herself. The Kythera's thick hide was better adapted to temperature extremes than human skin, but even Zara's natural protection had limits. Sarah could see that the alien's usually pristine bioluminescent strips were dimming from the thermal stress. Zara began moving toward the research station, carrying Sarah like a fragile piece of equipment. The alpha female's movements were careful and measured, navigating around the worst of the thermal vents while maintaining a pace that would get them to safety before either of their protective systems failed completely. From her vantage point in Zara's grip, Sarah could see the other Kythera following at a distance. The entire pack was relocating, abandoning territory they had held for years because the geological changes had made it uninhabitable. The cubs stayed close to their parents, their small forms dwarfed by the adults but moving with the same purposeful determination. Marcus and the rescue team had reached the halfway point between the station and the thermal field when they saw Zara approaching with Sarah. Through her helmet's failing communication system, Sarah could hear Marcus shouting orders to clear the airlock and prepare the medical bay. The station commander's voice carried a mixture of relief and disbelief that would become legendary in the retelling of these events. Zara carried Sarah to within 50 meters of the research station before carefully setting her down on ground that was merely hot, instead of lethally superheated. The alpha female's bioluminescent strips were now pulsing in patterns that Sarah's dying translation system couldn't parse. But the meaning was clear enough in any language. Obligation fulfilled, debt repaid. The human rescue team reached Sarah seconds later, immediately beginning emergency cooling procedures as they carried her toward the station's airlock. Through her helmet's cracked visor, Sarah maintained eye contact with Zara until the massive alien turned away and began leading her pack toward whatever new territory they would claim. The station's medical bay had been designed to handle routine injuries and minor emergencies, not full-scale thermal exposure. Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, the mission's medical officer, worked with practiced efficiency to assess Sarah's condition, while the automated systems cycled through emergency protocols. The environmental suit had done its job well enough to prevent fatal exposure, but Sarah was suffering from severe heat exhaustion and mild radiation sickness from the geological emissions. Vitals are stable, Amanda reported to Marcus as the cooling therapy began taking effect. She's going to be uncomfortable for a few days, but there shouldn't be any permanent damage. The suit's data logs show external temperatures that should have killed her within minutes. Marcus stood at the medical bay's observation window, watching the thermal vents continue their deadly display across what had been peaceful alien landscape just hours earlier. The geological event was unlike anything in the mission's database, suggesting that Kepler 442b still held surprises that could reshape their understanding of the planet's structure. "Where's the pack now?" Sarah asked weakly from the medical bed, her voice hoarse from breathing superheated air. "Thermal imaging shows them moving toward the Eastern Valley system," replied Dr. Park from the geology station. "It's higher ground, and the rock formations there should be more stable. They seem to know where they're going." Sarah nodded, feeling a strange mixture of loss and satisfaction. The pack was safe. The cubs were alive. But the relationship she had spent 18 months building had been fundamentally changed by the day's events. Humans and Kythera had moved beyond mere coexistence into something approaching genuine alliance. "Command is going to want a full report," Marcus said, but his tone suggested he wasn't looking forward to explaining how their lead xenobiologist had risked her life to save alien predators, or how one of those same predators had returned the favor. "Tell them the truth," Sarah replied, closing her eyes as the cooling therapy continued its work. "Tell them that we learned something important about the Kythera today. They understand concepts like debt and obligation. They can recognize when someone has helped them, and they can choose to help in return." Through the medical bay's small porthole, Sarah could see the Eastern Valley where the pack was establishing their new territory. The cubs would grow up there, and perhaps someday they would remember the strange creature that had carried them to safety when their world caught fire. More importantly, they would remember that sometimes help came from unexpected sources, and that survival often depended on cooperation across species boundaries. The thermal event was still active, turning the former Kythera territory into an uninhabitable wasteland of superheated gas and unstable rock. But in the Eastern Valley, 5 young predators were learning about trust, cooperation, and the strange alien creatures who had built a research station to study their kind. It was a lesson that would reshape the relationship between two species in ways that neither human nor Kythera could yet imagine. As Sarah drifted into an exhausted sleep, the last thing she heard was Dr. Park's voice reporting that the pack had successfully established a temporary den in the Eastern Valley. The cubs were safe, the adults were adapting to their new territory, and the mission that had nearly ended in tragedy was about to begin a new chapter in interspecies relations. 3 weeks after the thermal event, the research station had settled into an uneasy routine. The spectacular geological disaster that had nearly killed Sarah and displaced an entire Kythera pack had created new research opportunities, even as it complicated existing studies. The Eastern Valley, where Zara's pack had relocated, was technically outside the station's authorized observation zone, requiring a mountain of paperwork and approval requests from Earth to continue their work. Sarah stood in the station's rebuilt observation deck, watching the morning hunt unfold in the valley below. Her recovery from the thermal exposure had been faster than anyone expected, though Dr. Rodriguez still insisted on daily medical checks. The real healing had come from watching the pack adapt to their new territory with remarkable resilience. The cubs, now noticeably larger after their growth spurt, had taken to their new environment with the adaptability of youth. Scout, the boldest of the 5, had already established himself as the pack's advanced scout, exploring territory boundaries with fearless curiosity. The others followed his lead, learning the skills they would need to survive in a world that could change without warning. "Long-range communications array is back online," reported Dr. James Park, the station's newest addition. The younger brother of their geologist, Lisa, he had arrived on the emergency supply ship that finally reached them after the thermal event. His specialty in xenolinguistics had made him invaluable for interpreting the increasingly complex behavioral patterns they were observing. "Any word from Colonial? Command about the territory extension request?" Marcus asked, his voice carrying the weariness of someone who had spent weeks arguing with bureaucrats across interstellar distances. "Approved, but with conditions," James replied, scanning through the official documentation on his tablet. "They want detailed behavioral assessments of human Kythera interaction protocols before they'll authorize expanded observation rights. Apparently, Sarah's rescue mission has generated significant interest in the xenobiology community. Sarah smiled despite herself. The story of a human researcher saving alien predator cubs had indeed captured imaginations across human space. The rescue had been documented through her suit's emergency recording systems, providing unprecedented footage of Cathara parental behavior under extreme stress. More importantly, Zara's decision to save Sarah in return had challenged fundamental assumptions about alien intelligence and social structures. Through the observation deck's enhanced optics, Sarah watched as Zara led the pack in coordinating their hunt of a large herbivore that had wandered into the valley. The tactical sophistication displayed by the pack was remarkable, with each adult taking specific positions to control the prey's movement, while the cubs observed from safe distances. It was a masterclass in predator behavior that would have been impossible to document under normal circumstances. "Contact approaching from the north," announced Dr. Rodriguez from the sensor station. "Single adult moving at standard approach speed." Sarah activated the long-range visual scanners and immediately recognized the distinctive bioluminescent pattern. "It's Vera, one of the pack mothers. She's coming alone." This was unusual. The Cathara typically approached the station in groups when they chose to approach at all. Individual contact had been rare even before the thermal event, and Sarah couldn't recall any instance of a pack member other than Zara initiating solo communication. "Could be territorial reconnaissance," suggested James, his xenolinguistic training making him cautious about assigning human motivations to alien behavior. "The pack might be assessing whether we pose a threat to their new territory." Sarah was already suiting up for external contact. The environmental gear had been upgraded with better thermal protection following her near-death experience, though the improvements felt somewhat redundant given the stable geology of the Eastern Valley. "I'm going out to meet her. Monitor communications and be ready for emergency extraction if needed." The morning air of Kepler 442b carried sense that Sarah had learned to associate with different weather patterns and seasonal changes. Today there was something new in the atmospheric mix, a subtle chemical signature that suggested the thermal event had affected more than just the immediate area around the original den site. Vera approached with the careful dignity that Sarah had learned to associate with Cathara adult behavior. The alien's bioluminescent strips were pulsing in patterns that James's translation algorithms identified as formal greeting sequences mixed with something more complex. "Request assistance," the computer suggested, though the confidence level was low. "Easy, Vera," Sarah said softly, using the name she had assigned to help the research team distinguish between pack members. "What brings you here alone?" The Cathara female paused at the customary 10-meter communication distance and began a complex series of bioluminescent displays. Sarah's suit computer worked overtime to process the visual language, identifying fragments and partial concepts that slowly coalesced into meaning. Cubs, illness, help needed. Sarah's heart skipped as the implications became clear. "James, are you getting this? Vera's saying something about the cubs being sick." "Confirmed," came James's voice through the comm system. "The linguistic pattern suggests she's asking for assistance with a medical problem. This could be our first opportunity to establish formal cooperative protocols." But Sarah was already thinking beyond protocols and procedures. If the cubs were genuinely ill, time could be critical. The thermal event might have exposed them to harmful chemicals or radiation that were only now manifesting symptoms. Human medical technology might be able to help where Cathara natural immunity had limits. Vera continued her communication display, and Sarah began to understand the sophisticated nature of Cathara visual language. The bioluminescent patterns weren't just emotional expressions, but complex grammatical structures capable of conveying abstract concepts and temporal relationships. The cubs had become ill 2 days ago. Traditional pack remedies weren't working. Vera was specifically requesting human assistance based on Sarah's previous rescue of the young ones. "Marcus, I need authorization to accompany Vera back to the den site," Sarah said through her comm system. "If the cubs are seriously ill, we might be their only hope for treatment." There was a pause before Marcus responded, and Sarah could imagine the internal struggle between his protective instincts and his scientific curiosity. "Medical team is on standby. Dr. Rodriguez is preparing portable diagnostic equipment." But Sarah, we don't know anything about Kythera physiology beyond basic observations. We could do more harm than good. We also could save their lives, Sarah replied, already beginning the trek toward the eastern valley. Vera wouldn't have come alone unless the situation was desperate. The pack trusts us now. We can't let them down. The journey to the new den site took 40 minutes across terrain that shifted between rocky outcroppings and patches of alien vegetation. Vera maintained a steady pace that allowed Sarah to keep up, while clearly demonstrating impatience with human limitations. The Kythera female occasionally paused to emit low-frequency calls that echoed across the valley, receiving responses that Sarah's audio pickups could barely detect. When they reached the temporary den site, Sarah was struck by how quickly the pack had adapted to their new circumstances. The rocky formations of the eastern valley had been modified with the same architectural sophistication she had observed at the original site, creating a complex of tunnels and chambers that provided both security and climate control. Zara emerged from the main den entrance as they approached, her bioluminescent patterns displaying obvious relief at seeing Sarah. The alpha female had grown noticeably thinner over the past weeks, suggesting that the pack was still struggling to establish reliable hunting patterns in their new territory. Inside the den, Sarah found a scene that broke her heart. 4 of the 5 cubs lay listlessly in the main nursery chamber, their usually vibrant bioluminescent strips dim and flickering irregularly. Only Scout seemed relatively healthy, though even he was showing signs of whatever ailment had struck his siblings. Dr. Rodriguez's voice crackled through the comm system as Sarah activated her suit's medical scanners. Reading suggests some form of systemic toxicity. Could be environmental exposure or possibly a biological pathogen. I'm seeing elevated stress indicators across all the young specimens. Sarah knelt beside the closest cub, extending her gloved hand slowly. The small creature that had once struck out at her with tiny claws now barely reacted to her presence. Its breathing was labored, and the normal alertness that characterized young Kythera was completely absent. "We need to get them back to the station," Sarah said, knowing even as she spoke that the logistics would be nearly impossible. "Our medical bay has the equipment to analyze their condition and potentially synthesize treatment options." Zara's response was immediate and unmistakable. The alpha female positioned herself between Sarah and the cubs, her bioluminescent displays showing protective aggression mixed with desperate hope. The pack would not willingly separate from their young, but they were running out of options for helping them. The makeshift medical facility that the research team assembled in the station's cargo bay looked like something from humanity's earliest space exploration days. Portable medical scanners, emergency life support systems, and improvised containment units created a maze of cables and humming machinery that would have seemed chaotic to outside observers. But Dr. Rodriguez moved through it with practiced efficiency, adapting human medical technology to treat patients that evolution had never intended it to encounter. Getting the cubs to the station had required a delicate negotiation that tested every assumption about Kythera's social structure. Zara had eventually agreed to allow 2 cubs to accompany Sarah for treatment, but only after Scout, the healthiest of the 5, had been sent back to the den as a guarantee of human good faith. The remaining 4 cubs lay in specially modified environmental chambers while the station's computers worked overtime to analyze their biological systems. "Blood chemistry is unlike anything in our databases," Dr. Rodriguez reported, studying the readouts from her adapted scanners. "But the patterns suggest heavy metal poisoning, possibly from rare earth elements displaced by the thermal event. Their respiratory systems are showing damage consistent with inhaling metallic particulates." Sarah stood beside the chamber holding the smallest cub, a female they had designated as tiny due to her diminutive size even among her siblings. The young Kythera's bioluminescent strips were barely flickering, and her breathing had become increasingly labored over the past 6 hours. If the human medical team couldn't find a treatment soon, they would lose her. "Chelation therapy might work," suggested Dr. Park from the chemistry station. "If we can synthesize compounds that will bind to the heavy metals and allow natural elimination, we might be able to reverse the poisoning. The challenge is adapting human pharmaceutical knowledge to an alien metabolism." Outside the cargo bay, the rest of the Kythera pack had taken up residence around the research station. It was an unprecedented situation that had required Marcus to declare a general emergency and suspend normal station operations. 8 adult predators, each capable of killing a human with a single swipe of their claws, had essentially surrounded the human outpost. They weren't threatening, but their presence was a constant reminder of what was at stake. "Zara's been pacing the perimeter for 12 hours, reported James from the observation deck. "Her stress patterns suggest she's barely maintaining emotional control. If we lose one of the cubs, I'm not sure how the pack will react." Sarah nodded, understanding the implications. The trust that had been built between humans and Cathara over the past years could be destroyed if the cubs died under human care. Worse, the pack might view the research station as responsible for the poisoning, since the thermal event had occurred near human territory. Dr. Rodriguez activated the pharmaceutical synthesizer, a piece of equipment that had been designed to create human medications from basic chemical components during long-term space missions. Adapting it to produce treatments for alien biochemistry was pushing the technology far beyond its intended parameters, but it was their only option. "First test batch is ready," she announced, holding up a syringe filled with pale blue liquid. "Computer modeling suggests this should bind to the metallic compounds without causing additional toxicity, but we're essentially flying blind here." The decision of which cub to treat first was agonizing. Tiny was the sickest, but her small size made her the most vulnerable to potential side effects. The other 3 cubs were in better condition but still declining rapidly. Sarah found herself facing the kind of decision that had haunted battlefield medics throughout human history. Who to save when you couldn't save everyone? "We start with Tiny," Sarah decided, her voice steadier than she felt. "If the treatment works, we'll know quickly. If it doesn't..." She left the sentence unfinished. Dr. Rodriguez prepared the injection with the careful precision that had made her one of the Colonial Medical Service's most respected physicians. The syringe was designed for human patients, but she had modified the delivery system to account for Cathara skin density and vascular structure. It was improvisation on a level that would either save lives or hasten death. The injection itself was anticlimactic. Tiny barely reacted to the needle, her depleted energy reserves leaving her almost unconscious. The real test would come over the next several hours as the chelation compounds began working through her system. "Vital signs are holding steady," Dr. Rodriguez reported after 30 minutes. "No immediate adverse reactions. If this works, we should see improvement in respiratory function within 6 hours." Through the cargo bay's communication system, they could hear the adult Cathara moving around the station's perimeter. Their vocalizations had changed from the anxious calls of earlier in the day to something more structured and purposeful. James's translation algorithm suggested they were conducting some form of ritual or ceremony, though the specific meaning remained unclear. "They're praying," Sarah realized suddenly, "or the Cathara equivalent. They're asking their gods or ancestors or whatever spiritual framework they have to protect their young." The thought that these powerful predators had their own religious or spiritual practices was sobering. It added another layer of complexity to creatures that human science was only beginning to understand. The Cathara weren't just intelligent animals or primitive tool users. They were a species with culture, beliefs, and traditions that might stretch back thousands of years. 6 hours later, Tiny's condition began to improve. Her respiratory distress eased first. Then her bioluminescent strips began showing more regular patterns. By the 12-hour mark, she was responding to external stimuli and showing interest in her surroundings. The chelation therapy was working. "Treat the others," Sarah ordered, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. "Same dosage, same protocols. We're going to save them all." The next 48 hours became a blur of medical procedures, constant monitoring, and gradual improvement. Each cub responded to the treatment at their own pace, but all 4 showed steady recovery from what would have been fatal poisoning. Dr. Rodriguez later estimated that without human intervention, the cubs would have died within a week of symptom onset. When the cubs were finally strong enough for discharge, Sarah faced another complex negotiation with the pack. The adult Cathara had maintained their vigil around the station, accepting food offerings from the humans, but remaining essentially motionless for 2 straight days. Their patience and discipline impressed even Marcus, who had spent years studying military logistics and understood the difficulty of maintaining readiness over extended periods. Zara entered the cargo bay cautiously, her massive frame moving with surprising delicacy around the medical equipment. When she saw her cubs awake and responsive, The alpha female's bioluminescent patterns erupted in sequences so rapid and complex that they overloaded James's translation systems. Joy, Sarah thought. Pure, overwhelming joy that transcended species barriers. The reunion between parents and cubs was emotional even by human standards. The adult Kythera nuzzled and examined their young ones with gentle thoroughness, while the cubs responded with the energetic chittering that Sarah had learned indicated happiness and excitement. Scout, who had been returned to the den earlier, was noticeably relieved to be reunited with his siblings. They'll remember this, James observed, recording the interaction for future analysis. This event will become part of their cultural memory, possibly for generations. We've established a precedent for interspecies medical cooperation that could reshape human-Kythera relations. Sarah nodded, watching as the pack prepared to return to their Eastern Valley territory. The cubs were still weak but mobile, able to make the journey home with assistance from their parents. In a few weeks, they would be fully recovered and ready to resume their development into the apex predators their genetics intended them to become. But something fundamental had changed in the relationship between the two species. Humans had saved Kythera lives twice now, and the pack had repaid the debt once. They were no longer separate species sharing the same planet. They were potential allies in a universe that contained countless unknowns and dangers. As the pack disappeared into the alien landscape, Sarah realized that the real discovery wasn't about Kythera intelligence or social structure. It was about the possibility that cooperation might be a universal principle. That species separated by millions of years of evolution could still find common ground in the fundamental drive to protect and nurture life. The message from Earth arrived on a routine data burst 6 months after the Cubs' recovery, but its content sent shockwaves through the research station that would fundamentally alter their mission parameters. Colonial Command had made a decision based on the detailed reports of human-Kythera cooperation. Kepler 442b was being reclassified from a research outpost to a full diplomatic mission. They're sending a diplomatic team, Marcus announced to the assembled station personnel, his voice carrying a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Ambassador Chen arrives in 18 months with a full cultural integration specialist staff. Our job is to prepare the groundwork for formal first contact protocols. Sarah stood at the observation deck, watching the Eastern Valley where Zara's pack had thrived since their relocation. The cubs, now approaching adolescence, had grown into impressive young predators, while retaining the curiosity and intelligence that had made them so remarkable. Scout had become particularly bold, occasionally approaching the station's perimeter alone to observe human activities with obvious fascination. First contact protocols assume we're dealing with a technological civilization, Dr. Rodriguez pointed out during the mission briefing. The Kythera use tools and have complex social structures, but they haven't developed agriculture, permanent settlements, or anything resembling industrial capacity. James Park looked up from his linguistic analysis workstation. That might be changing faster than we realize. I've been tracking communication patterns between different packs across the valley system, and there's evidence of information sharing that suggests proto-governmental cooperation. The implications were staggering. If the Kythera were naturally developing toward civilization during the period of human observation, it raised questions about whether their presence had somehow catalyzed social evolution. The thermal event and subsequent medical cooperation might have demonstrated concepts like technology and interspecies alliance that were previously outside Kythera experience. We need to expand our observation network, Sarah suggested. If other packs are adopting new behaviors based on what happened with Zara's group, we're witnessing cultural evolution in real time. The diplomatic team will need comprehensive data about Kythera social development. The expansion project took 3 months to implement, with automated observation stations placed throughout the valley system at distances that wouldn't interfere with normal Kythera activities. The data they collected painted a picture of a species in the midst of unprecedented change. 7 different packs had established territory in the expanded observation zone, and their interactions showed clear evidence of coordinated behavior. Hunting territories that had previously been defended with lethal aggression were now being shared through complex negotiation rituals. Information about successful hunting techniques was being transmitted between groups through elaborate bioluminescent displays that could be seen across vast distances. Most remarkably, The packs had begun constructing what could only be described as meeting places. Large stone circles, carefully arranged in patterns that showed obvious planning and cooperation, had appeared at territorial boundaries. James's analysis of the construction techniques suggested that multiple packs were working together on projects that served the entire community rather than individual groups. They're becoming a civilization, Sarah observed during one of their weekly analysis sessions. We're watching it happen generation by generation. The cubs that Sarah had saved were now at the center of this transformation. Scout had emerged as something approaching a diplomat, traveling between packs to facilitate the communication that was driving social change. His siblings had taken on specialized roles within their own pack structure, with each showing aptitudes that went beyond traditional Cathera survival skills. Tiny, despite her early health crisis, had become the pack's primary toolmaker. She had learned to shape stone and metal in ways that previous generations had never attempted, creating implements that improved hunting efficiency and den construction. Her innovations were being copied by other packs through the growing information network. Contact approaching from the southeast, announced the automated detection system. Multiple adults coordinated movement pattern. Through the observation deck's enhanced optics, Sarah could see a delegation unlike anything they had previously observed. Representatives from at least 4 different packs were approaching the research station together, their bioluminescent patterns synchronized in displays that suggested formal diplomatic protocols. Zara led the group, but she was accompanied by alpha individuals from the other packs. Their approach was careful and ritualized, with each step following patterns that James's computers identified as emerging ceremonial behavior. This wasn't a casual visit or a request for assistance. It was something approaching a state delegation. They want to talk, Sarah realized, not just communicate basic needs or emotions, but engage in formal diplomatic contact. The implications sent the station into controlled chaos. The research team had protocols for individual Kythera contact and emergency cooperation, but nothing in their training had prepared them for what appeared to be an official diplomatic overture from an emerging alien civilization. Sarah suited up for external contact, while Marcus opened communication channels with Colonial Command. The diplomatic team was still 16 months away, but first contact was apparently happening right now. The decision of how to respond would fall to a xenobiologist, a station commander, and a team of researchers who had never expected to become humanity's first alien ambassadors. The delegation stopped at the formal communication distance, but their arrangement was more complex than usual. Zara stood at the center, but the other pack leaders formed a semicircle that clearly indicated equal status. When they began their bioluminescent display, the synchronized patterns created a visual symphony that James's translation algorithms struggled to process. They're introducing themselves, James reported through the comm system. Formal names, territorial designations, and what appears to be their credentials for speaking on behalf of their respective communities. This is definitely diplomatic protocol. Sarah stepped forward carefully, aware that her response would establish precedents that might echo through centuries of interspecies relations. "I am Sarah Chen," she said aloud while activating her suit's own light display systems to provide visual accompaniment to her words. "I speak for the human research mission and our people beyond the stars." The response was immediate and sophisticated. Zara's patterns shifted to acknowledge Sarah's introduction while maintaining the formal diplomatic framework. But then something unexpected happened. Scout emerged from behind the adult delegation and approached Sarah directly. The young Cathara, now nearly adult-sized but still showing the distinctive markings of his generation, began a complex display that left James's computers struggling to keep up. He's speaking directly to you," James reported with amazement. "Individual to individual, not as part of the formal delegation. He's referencing the rescue, the medical treatment, and what appears to be a personal debt that transcends official protocols." Sarah knelt to bring herself closer to Scout's eye level, recognizing that this moment was as important as any formal diplomatic exchange. The young predator she had carried to safety was now serving as a bridge between two species, translating not just language but cultural concepts that would determine the future of human-Cathara relations. "Tell me what you need," Sarah said softly, knowing that Scout's response would shape the diplomatic mission that was already en route from Earth. Scout's bioluminescent display shifted to patterns that were both familiar and revolutionary. He was proposing something that had never existed in Kythera culture before the thermal event, a permanent alliance between species, based on mutual aid and shared territory. The young predator that Sarah had saved from a burning nest was now offering to help build a new kind of civilization, one where humans and Kythera could work together as equals in a universe full of unknown challenges. It was an offer that would test every assumption about intelligence, civilization, and the possibilities for cooperation between species that had evolved under different stars. 5 years after the thermal event that had changed everything, the Kepler 442b diplomatic complex stood as humanity's first successful interspecies embassy. The sprawling facility incorporated both human engineering and Kythera architectural principles, creating a unique fusion of technologies that served as a model for cooperative development throughout human space. Ambassador Chen walked through the complex's central courtyard, observing the daily interactions that had become routine, but never ceased to amaze visitors from Earth. Human children played alongside young Kythera in carefully supervised groups, while their parents worked together on projects that ranged from atmospheric processing to advanced materials research. The species that had once been predator and prey had become something unprecedented, true partners in civilization. Sarah, now bearing the title of Senior Xenological Advisor, stood beside the memorial stone that marked the site where the cubs had been rescued. The simple monument, carved from native stone by Kythera artisans and inscribed with human text, commemorated the moment when two species had chosen cooperation over conflict. Scout, now a full adult and serving as the primary Kythera liaison, often visited the memorial with his own offspring. The mining consortium reports are positive, Ambassador Chen noted, reviewing the latest economic data on her tablet. The joint extraction operations in the northern mountains are producing rare earth elements at efficiency levels that exceed our most optimistic projections. Kythera thermal sensing is proving invaluable for locating high-grade ore deposits. The economic partnership had evolved naturally from the initial research cooperation. Kythera senses, evolved for hunting in complex terrain, were perfectly adapted for geological survey work. Human technology could extract and process materials that Kythera strength and endurance could access in environments too dangerous for mechanical equipment. The combination had created a mining operation that was both more productive and more environmentally sustainable than either species could have achieved alone. The university exchange program is showing similar success, Sarah added, gesturing toward the educational complex where human and Kythera scholars worked together on projects that challenged fundamental assumptions about intelligence and learning. Kythera spatial reasoning abilities are revolutionizing our approach to engineering problems. While human mathematical concepts are helping them develop predictive models for long-term resource management, young Kythera were proving to be natural mathematicians once they were introduced to abstract numerical concepts. Their hunting-evolved ability to calculate trajectories and timing translated directly into advanced calculus and physics applications. Meanwhile, human students were learning to think in 3 dimensions with an intuitive grasp that typically took years to develop. The success stories extended beyond economics and education. The joint medical research program had led to breakthrough treatments for both species. Kythera regenerative abilities had inspired new approaches to human trauma medicine, while human pharmaceutical knowledge had eliminated several genetic disorders that had plagued Kythera populations for generations. Ambassador, we have the weekly report from the Outer System Monitoring Stations, announced Dr. Park, now the complex's Director of Communications. His team maintained contact with the expanding network of human Kythera research outposts that were exploring other worlds in the system. The partnership had proven so successful that it was being replicated throughout human space. Other colonies were requesting Kythera consultants for their own development projects, while young Kythera were volunteering for off-world assignments that their ancestors would never have imagined. The species that had never traveled beyond their home valley was now helping to explore the galaxy. Scout approached the group with the measured dignity that characterized adult Kythera, his bioluminescent patterns displaying formal greeting sequences mixed with personal affection. At 43 in Kythera years, he was approaching middle age but remained as curious and innovative as he had been as a cub. His role as liaison had evolved into something approaching that of a cultural ambassador, helping both species navigate the complexities of interspecies cooperation. The Council of Pax has approved the proposal for the Deep Space Research Station. Scout communicated through the translation interface that had replaced the crude light displays of earlier years. 3 volunteers from each pack will participate in the joint mission to Kepler 442c. Sarah smiled at the news. The ice-covered moon orbiting the system's gas giant had shown signs of subsurface oceans that might harbor life. A joint human-Kythera research mission would provide twice the expertise and redundancy for what would be humanity's most ambitious exploration project to date. Your offspring will be old enough to participate in the next wave of missions, Sarah observed, watching as Scout's 2 cubs played with human children in the courtyard. The young ones showed the same fearless curiosity that had characterized their father, but they were growing up in a world where interspecies cooperation was normal rather than revolutionary. Scout's response carried undertones of pride and anticipation. They speak of traveling to other star systems, of meeting new species that might join our alliance. The universe has become much larger since you carried us from the burning nest. Ambassador Chen looked up from her reports, struck by the casual reference to galactic exploration. The Colonial Senate has approved funding for the first interstellar colony ships designed for multi-species crews. If the Kythera Council agrees, we could have joint exploration teams reaching other star systems within a decade. The conversation was interrupted by an alert from the communications center. Long-range sensors had detected an unidentified object entering the outer system, moving on a trajectory that suggested intelligent control rather than natural celestial mechanics. After years of peaceful development, the Kepler 442b system was about to receive its first visitors from unknown space. Contact protocols are standing by, Dr. Park reported, his voice carrying the excitement of someone who had spent years preparing for this moment. Joint response teams are assembling at the orbital station. Sarah felt a familiar surge of anticipation mixed with apprehension. 5 years ago, she had risked her life to save alien cubs from a thermal disaster. That act of compassion had led to the first successful alliance between humanity and another intelligent species. Now they were about to face the ultimate test of that alliance. "Ready the diplomatic vessel," Ambassador Chen ordered. "If we're about to make contact with a third species, they'll see humans and Kythera working together as equals. That might be the most important message we can send." Scout's bioluminescent patterns shifted to display determination and readiness. "The pack stands with our human allies, as we have since the day you chose to save rather than abandon our young. Whatever approaches from the void will find not one species, but 2 united in purpose." As the diplomatic team prepared for humanity's next great adventure, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. A simple act of rescue had become the foundation for an interstellar alliance. 5 frightened cubs had grown into adults who were helping to shape the future of galactic civilization. The nest had caught fire, but from the ashes had risen something unprecedented in the known galaxy. Proof that intelligence, compassion, and cooperation could transcend the boundaries of evolution itself. As they prepared to meet whatever intelligence had found their small corner of the universe, humans and Kythera stood together as partners in the greatest adventure of all, the expansion of consciousness and cooperation among the stars. The universe had become a much larger place since that day when a human woman had chosen to risk everything to save alien children. Now it was about to become larger still, with the promise that the alliance, born in crisis and forged in trust, would serve as a model for whatever wonders and challenges awaited among the infinite stars.